Out of all the games that people have requested I take a look at over the years, Battlefield Bad Company has to be in the top 5.
Hey, win the war for us, press!
It's a console-only entry in the long-running Battlefield series, released during the peak popularity of the 7th generation consoles, around the time when military shooters were really becoming the dominant genre. It isn't the first console-only game in the franchise though, and hardcore fans are going to remember Modern Combat that came out on the Xbox and the PS2 a few years prior, an underrated game which still mostly holds up. Unlike Modern Combat though, which just had a series of vaguely connected missions, Bad Company has an actual campaign, with fully voiced characters, cinematics, and a storyline with a premise and a payoff.
You sure you're in the right place?
Definitely stands out amongst other games from that same time period. I mean, around this point in time we had games like Modern Warfare, World at War, Rainbow Six Vegas, not to mention the undisputed masterpiece SAS Secure Tomorrow.
Show us his cell and then sod off, Mr. Guard. And you're bloody welcome.
And as a console shooter, it was also making some pretty big strides. About the closest thing I'd compare this to is Far Cry Instincts, which came out a couple of years prior. But then I think the scope of what you can actually do in Bad Company is a lot bigger.
Okay, the shot's out! The shot is out! Confirmed! Okay, that's confirmed.
I do feel like games from this era tend to kinda go one or two ways. They often age really well and you can pick them up and play them today like time hasn't even passed. Or instead, you play them but you can really start to see the elements which make them feel like a product of their time. I think I'd say that's how I describe maybe half my time with Bad Company. You know, a game which unironically seems to use the impact font during its intro cinematic. So in Bad Company, you're playing as the most generic looking guy ever named Preston Marlowe, but he really may as well be named Joey Jojo Soldier Boy, because he's a completely forgettable personality that just doesn't really stand out in the slightest. Maybe that's done as a way to make it easier for the player to like self-insert into his combat boots. Either way though, this guy's about as boring as slightly toasted white bread, and about as charming as a stuffed possum.
You don't know how glad I am to hear that.
Thankfully though, the other characters do kinda make up for it, because you see, Joey Jojo's been assigned to the eponymous Bad Company, a squad made up of so-called troublemakers and loose cannons, because yeah, apparently just discharging someone from the military isn't a thing in this game.
His name is Hacker.
Hey, how you doing? You smell very clean.
My name's Redford, you can call me that. Or Sarge. We're all in this mess together now.
Anyway, despite these guys having a reputation as being subpar soldiers, it's pretty damn clear from the get-go that they're actually incredibly effective at what they do, being this small army that just causes chaos and destruction everywhere they go.
Oh, man!
And eventually the plot involves these guys going after a stockpile of mercenary-owned gold bars, which are being transported by a convoy of trucks. Yeah, it's more or less the same storyline as the film Kelly's Heroes, with again a bunch of cynical, jaded soldiers going off the grid to try to make their own fortunes. And for what it is a pretty fun little story. There's some genuine chemistry between the members of Bad Company, and the way Sweetwater and Hags have this ongoing game of rock, paper, scissors during a bunch of the cinematics keeps the whole thing feeling lighthearted. This campaign was also a pretty big deal at the time because, you know, prior to this, for almost every single Battlefield game, the campaigns had really just been an afterthought. Now you had this fully fleshed out story with plot twists, revelations, and characters like Joey Jojo all stuck along for the ride.
Where did Hacker go?
The only thing I don't understand here is why the game doesn't have subtitles. I mean, look man, I only get a few hours a day now when I have spare time to play video games, and most of that is when my kid is asleep. So playing a military shooter that uses explosions like they're full stops, you know, at a loud volume, ain't really beneficial to his sleeping patterns. Simply adding in subtitles so I could hear what people are saying, you know, might have been nice, but I don't know, I guess it's something they overlooked. Yeah, I guess if you're hard of hearing, maybe just go fuck yourself.
Buckle up.
Either way though, the story is definitely one of the better aspects of the game here, and it goes a long way when you genuinely care what happens to people in a video game. You know, more so when they're the ones that you're supposed to empathize with.
Say goodbye to the gold.
So, I wonder what jail's gonna be like.
I hear the food's pretty good.
Now, I don't know if this game took any influence from Far Cry or even Crysis, which had come out like a year before, but it is kind of similar to both of those games in the way that it drops you onto these large island maps overrun by enemy soldiers and then lets you choose your own path forward.
Marlowe, You take a look.
The map always shows your next objective, which often just involves blowing something up, but then how you get there and how long that's going to take is a choice that gets left up to the player.
There.
Going off the beaten path, you'll often find hidden weapons along with collectible gold bars, complete with a very Pulp Fiction-esque animation as you open them. Or, I don't know, maybe it's supposed to be like an obscure reference to finding gold chalices behind portraits of Hitler in Wolfenstein 3D. You've got drivable tanks, APCs, jeeps, and boats, along with a combat chopper for what has to be the best mission in the entire game.
I've got target destroyed. That's the one.
Then, regardless of how you reach your destination, you've got a few options on how you want to initiate combat. And it's just like this sense of freedom to the gameplay, which is really fun. And also for that reason why games like Far Cry and Crysis were also so fun to play. The age of the corridor shooters was really long gone by this point, and it's around this time that the open world genre really started to find its footing. I mean, consider that around this point in time is when we got games like the first Assassin's Creed, Far Cry 2, not to mention Fallout 3. Yeah, all vast, exploration-rich environments that the player could get lost in for dozens, if not hundreds of hours. It's also the kind of thing that could really only come out on the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3 with the newfangled power those consoles provided. Kinda makes sense why people loved this game so much at the time. You know, considering there really hadn't been anything like it on the platforms prior to this. This was also the first time we ever saw DICE's Frostbite engine in action, and while it does kind of look pretty rough around the edges by today's standards, one thing I think it still does really well is how it gives you that sense of just causing all-out carnage during almost every single gunfight. It almost never seems to dip in performance either, at least on the Xbox, which is a godsend, especially when you're in the kind of combat encounters that could level a small village. Almost every single building in the game can have its walls blown off, and this is something that's going to work for or against the player. Yeah, don't want to find the front door here? Well, just blow out the side of the building and head on in that way. If you take cover in that building during combat, well, then enemies are likely to blow the walls away too. However, enemies also happen to hide inside buildings quite a lot too. You know, in fact, they hide and camp in buildings so often, you'd think you'd almost somehow crossed over into the multiplayer mode without realizing. And it really does never get old destroying stuff here. You know, even something simple like blowing up a sandbag with a grenade has a real sense of power to it.
You'll get some metal.
The feeling you get blowing a hole in a wall with a grenade launcher is the kind of feeling I imagine God must get when he blows a hole in a wall with a grenade launcher. I don't know, man. I guess I'm just trying to say it's a really satisfying destruction system, you know, even if it really just is the same looking destroyed wall effect over and over. I mean, you're not actually dynamically destroying buildings, you're really just shooting preset hole into the walls. It can also kind of backfire in some ways, making it kind of hard to see ahead of you when your entire screen is covered in smoke and dust particles. And I had more than a few combat sequences where the sustained gunfire from attacking enemies just made it so I couldn't even see where I was getting attacked from. It's also not quite on the same level that we'd get a year later with Red Faction Guerrilla. Still think that game takes the trophy for some of the best destruction physics of all time. What I think reminds me the most of here is Black. You know that first-person shooter that came back in 2006? Which had a similar fetish for over-the-top explosions and realistic gun sounds. And I think anyone who's played Black is probably going to remember the way, and if you shoot so much as a propane tank, it's like half the goddamn planet explodes from it. Still has some of the best looking explosions and particle effect for that era of shooters, most of which was done to mask how it's otherwise a pretty basic game. The difference is, in Black, this was all just really done for show. Like, it didn't really factor into how the game played, but in Bad Company, it's a lot different, and this time it actually has a dynamic effect. So it looks, feels, and most importantly, sounds good. But yeah, speaking of the sound work, the sound design is incredible in this game. It's always something the Battlefield games have kind of nailed, just being this unfiltered ear porn you get from firing all the weapons, and that definitely carries across here to the abundance of explosions.
Just like back home.
Then when you're firing weapons indoors, the sound effects are completely different, you know, to show the difference in acoustics, and I can imagine someone had a hell of a lot of fun in DICE's audio department pulling all of this stuff off. I think that would have to be one of the best video game jobs of all time. And I think if you're going to get involved in anything video game related, surely coming up with all the weapon sound effects has to be one of the top gigs. Along with, you know, modeling Cammy's thighs for every new entry in the Street Fighter series. As for the actual shooting side of things, well, this is where it kind of starts to get a bit interesting, and what you're really playing here is a multiplayer game in single player form. This does make sense given the pedigree of the series up until this point, and it's so subtle that you might not even notice it, but your brain did.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, so the first and biggest indicator to that is how you don't actually die in this game. Whenever you're killed by enemies in the many ways that's possible, you just respawn back at the last save point, none the worse for wear, with no penalty outside of just lost time. More than that too, the enemies you killed up until that point are still going to be dead, and any vehicles you might have left parked in the road are still going to be there in the same spot. Where it gets weird though is that it doesn't reset enemy behavior. Like I had one instance where after respawning, the chopper that had just killed me didn't even lose a beat and was still just dropping missiles on me. I mean, at that point I was basically being griefed by the AI in a single player game, and I mean, there has to be some kind of law against that, doesn't there?
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's times when you need to drive across the entire map to get to your next objective, and along the way there's just going to be legions of tanks and enemy soldiers with RPGs, both of whom are going to blow your shit up pretty damn quickly. And if there's a way to get past this section without just dying repeatedly, along with trying to thin out the ranks until everyone's dead, well, then I'd love to hear it. I think that's actually too why I found a lot of the areas in this game kind of unsatisfying to play through, and that's because I wasn't really overcoming any of these super challenging sections. It just felt like I was replaying them over and over until I'd finally killed enough bad guys so I could make it through.
We gotta move!
So yeah, like a respawning system ain't the kind of mechanic you'd expect to see in a single player game, right? But something that fits right in with a multiplayer one. Along with slander over someone's sexual preferences and lewd remarks about their mother's sexual history, the latter being something I'm an expert on.
We gotta move!
Secondly, to the respawning, you've got the guns, and the way that you're not really choosing guns here in a traditional sense. Instead, what you're doing is choosing a loadout, and you've got no further control over that loadout either. So if I pick up an assault rifle, it comes with a grenade launcher attachment. If I pick up an LMG or a shotgun, it comes with grenades. And if I pick up a sniper rifle, it comes with a pistol. I can't swap these out, and they're not interchangeable, so it's like I have to take both of them regardless, which is kind of limited. I really think this would have worked pretty well if they used that swapping mechanic from Modern Combat, where the player could swap back and forth between different soldiers to make use of their specific loadout. And this would have worked really well, I think, for the members of Bad Company, who all had their own unique loadouts and skill sets. Because as it is, they don't really do much during the game here, outside of just some light comic relief and shooting the occasional basic enemy.
Thanks, buddy.
The weapon reload times are also like something out of a tactical shooter, which seems kind of pointless to me in a game that's so action focused, but again, something that makes perfect sense in a PvP scenario to balance out the combat. I mean, goddamn son, managing reload times in multiplayer shooters is downright a learnable skill in and of itself. I mean, it literally took me years to stop reloading my gun by habit after every single kill I got, and I blame that mindset off me playing single player games for so long, like Half-Life and Return to Castle Wolfenstein. More than the reload times though is the time to kill, which again seems really high and again balanced with the multiplayer. Bad Company doesn't have regenerating health, despite that actually being the trend at the time. Instead, it's got like a health syringe, which works on a cooldown. And you'll be popping this thing so often that if it were heroin, well, you'd have turned into Iggy Pop before finishing the first level. And you honestly use this thing so much that you have to start to wonder why they didn't just use regenerating health and call it a day. I mean, it would have made a lot more sense.
Not bad!
I also feel too like the gadget you've got is almost more important than the gun. Now, aside from your main weapon and that healing syringe, you can also carry one gadget, like an RPG, C4 explosive, a repair tool, or binoculars, which can be used to call in all-important mortar strikes. All of which are gonna gadgets from the multiplayer. I mean, the Demolition class I think gets the RPG, and the Engineer gets the repair tool. And yeah, it makes sense, right? Almost every single gun in the game has iron sights, and they more or less seem to do the same amount of damage, so outside of a couple of key moments where a scoped rifle is almost essential, it doesn't really seem to matter too much what kind of gun you pick up. But with the gadgets, it really feels like it can often make or break your playthrough. For instance, if you're suddenly tasked with driving across the map and you don't have a repair tool, well, prepare to spend a lot of time having to bail out of exploding vehicles from all the damage you're going to take. Machine gun nests are semi-frequent in the game, and the best way to take these out by far is with an RPG. So again, if you don't have one on hand, well, good luck.
Good luck.
Fuck you!
There was one point where I think I took out maybe like a dozen tanks back to back with those binoculars, and if I didn't happen to randomly pick those things up like 15 minutes prior, or I'd picked up something else, and I can't even imagine how I would have gotten past this section.
Fuck you!
As for the bad stuff in Bad Company, well, that right there is just some good old mid-2000s FPS bullshit. For starters, you've got one of the most common offenses for console shooters, and that's the FOV, which is just insanely low here. I mean, goddamn son, it has to be like around 55 or so, and it just makes visibility awful when you're trying to shoot people at close range. Normally, I don't mind low FOVs too much, most of the time I can overlook it, but playing this, it just kind of feels like I'm zoomed in like 1.5 times more than I should be, and it's very off-putting. The aiming acceleration is also some of the worst I think I've ever experienced, making precise aiming a real pain in the ass. And yeah, I know you can't always rate an old game on how it controls, but there's still plenty of old console shooters that don't suffer from this problem. This also comes from that era where video games tried the best they could to look gritty and realistic, which is fine, I mean, that's a product of its time, but then it does mean that all the visual elements kind of blend together due to the color palette being so flat. What that means is you often can't really pick out enemies from the trees in the bush, and the radar has this kind of fake 3D effect to it, making it even harder to determine how close they are, nor does it even show if they're above or below you. I don't know if part of it's also something to do with me being as colorblind as a Labrador, but I don't know, I just kind of found it really hard to distinguish enemies from the background, and again, in a game where you're getting dropped like a bag of dirt from even the suggestion of gunfire, I mean, damn, it makes for some frustrating moments. I do feel like the other things I'd heap crap on would just be me insulting the game for the time it came out, and that just feels kind of redundant, especially considering the kind of games I usually talk about. Unless it's an objective fault or something, it just feels like I'd be complaining for the sake of complaining. And that's like making fun of Casablanca for being shot in black and white as opposed to color.
Your motto should be verba non acta, cause you never shut the hell up. Let's get out of here.
I do think despite all the forced camaraderie the game tries to instill, one of my favorite missions is actually the one where you're completely separated from your squad. Firstly, because without all that constant bickering from the side characters, I could actually concentrate on what was happening and appreciate all the elements that went into making the combat what it is. And then secondly, and more than that, was that when I finally reunited with these guys, I was actually kinda happy. And I realized that when you take that element away from this thing, it's really quite a forgettable game otherwise. I mean, these guys right here, man, they really put the bad in Bad Company, and I don't mean that as an insult. There's a universal connection that you make with these kind of characters, after you spend enough time with them that they're inevitably going to grow on you. And it's what made the difference from this just being a mid-2000s run-of-the-mill open-world shooter to what makes it what it is, Bad Company. So yeah, I get it. I can see why a 15-year-old kid playing this for the first time on his brand new 360 or PS3 looks back fondly on it as much as he does the first time he saw boobs. I think out of all the campaigns they've worked on since, it still stands head and shoulders out amongst the rest. I mean, it's sure a hell of a lot better than Battlefield 4. Yikes. But the years start coming and they don't stop coming, and in 2010, DICE would follow up Bad Company with Bad Company 2. This time too, it seemed like they'd learned from the previous installment and also made this one available for the PC as well as the consoles.
Whoa, how about that?
And much like the first game, it was a huge success, selling loads of copies and also becoming one of the most popular entries in the series, with again another campaign that I've seen a whole lot of people speak highly of, though I do think a fair bit of that just comes from the whole new is bad, old is good mentality that affects a lot of opinions these days.
Done. We should be able to see it any minute now.
Whereas the first game introduced the Frostbite engine, this game introduces Frostbite 1.5, and once you start to play this, you'll understand why it's a 0.5 and not an entire point. I mean, the destruction is definitely improved, and some of the more destructive moments in the campaign are still super entertaining, but it's really not that much of a leap up from the first game, and it's still a long ways off that Geomod 2.0 engine. I think the best way to describe it is that it just looks better. And I think even by today's standards when it comes to the visuals, the whole thing really does still hold up. This was like the turning point for video game visuals where everything started to stagnate, and the improvements from here on in I think got a lot less noticeable, which is why a lot of these games from that same time period still look half decent. More than that, Bad Company 2's just got a whole lot more variety to the environments. Instead of the same looking countrysides over and over, it's now snow-capped mountains, Middle Eastern villages, deserts, jungles, forests, and rainforests. Along with a prologue set in Japan, which almost feels like something out of an entirely different game, not to mention the Vietnam DLC that came out down the track.
What's he saying?
You know what too, like I'm actually kind of sad now that I missed out on this DLC in its heyday. I'm a really huge fan of that era and aesthetic, and there's like so few games anymore that make use of the setting. On another positive note, this time around there's actually subtitles. But then annoyingly, even if you're on PC, there's still no FOV slider. And that's actually a pretty good segue, because I often feel like the best way to describe Bad Company 2 is that it's a whole 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. And it seems for every couple of things this game does well, it also does something that just doesn't make sense.
Rally up, fellas.
For starters, it's much more linear than the first game. Gone are the open maps and drivable vehicles, and most of the vehicle sections are pretty much just on rails. Usually where you're controlling some kind of turret and have to shoot at a bunch of approaching enemies. The first controllable one in the campaign is in a boat where you're trying to go slowly upriver, a sequence which is entirely about increasing the tension and the atmosphere for the mission itself and doesn't even offer up any combat. Not to mention it's over in like 60 seconds. Later on you actually get to drive a Jeep for this high-speed chase, and this might have been fun, only you're having to drive this thing in the middle of the worst blizzard I think I've ever seen in a video game. I mean, seriously, just look at this. It's like I'm trying to drive while someone's throwing talcum powder in my eyes. I even started to think that this might have been like a glitch or something with my drivers. Like the game wasn't rendering the snow properly or something, but no man, I looked up a long play video on YouTube and it's equally as impossible to see shit in that video too. Which means that someone willingly made this sequence that obstructed on purpose. Yeah, nice one. It's not the only time it happens either. Later on there's a really cool mission in this desert where you get to drive another Jeep around to complete these objectives, and again, the same thing happens. And then again, later on when you're driving quad bikes, the same fucking thing. And all I could think of is that what DICE thinks makes graphics look more realistic, is just covering the whole screen in all these particle effects? And you know what, I don't think this would annoy me if it weren't for the fact that it doesn't seem to affect the enemies, who seem to be able to see right through it and shoot at you like it's nothing. On the plus side again, I like the fact that the game now has a dedicated grenade throw button, plus an actual customizable weapon loadout. You know, not just predetermined loadouts scattered around the map. Guns you pick up along the way now get added to an inventory and can be equipped at any of these supply drops you come across, and it actually gives you a reason to collect these, knowing you can get to use them later on down the track. But again, it's a 1 step back because the secondary items from the first game, like the repair tool, the C4 and the binoculars, only pop up during scripted moments. You don't get to pick and choose these anymore like you did in the previous game. I do think the regenerating health system works a lot better than the fixed health, just kind of makes more sense in a fast-paced action shooter like this, but then there also seems to be like such an inconsistency to the damage you take here, and deaths can often feel completely random.
Yes.
One sequence has you out running a mortar strike, and this had to take me like half a dozen attempts, because every time I tried to do it, the mortar strikes just damaged me differently.
Nice car.
Even a truck chase early on here seems to be completely randomized, and despite me doing the same thing every time when it came to attacking these pursuing vehicles, for some reason it was only like the 4th or 5th time that I seemed to get through it.
Come on, come on, come on.
Bad Company 2 brings back the returning characters from the first game, and it is nice to see them again, but I do think this story seems to be taking itself way too seriously now, where the plot of the entire world hangs in the balance, compared to the get-rich-quick scheme of a bunch of shady soldiers. Looking back on the first game, the escapades of these troublemakers going off the grid to try to make themselves rich off stolen gold, it was a fun and relatable story. Here though, the overall plot is about this dangerous EMP device developed by the Japanese back in World War II or something, and I don't know man, it just seems far too serious and gritty in comparison to that tone in the first game.
The black weapon. It's starting. We're dead, man.
It's like the entire fate of the world now rests in these guys' hands, man, instead of the entire fate of their bank accounts. I also heard the game throwing a fair bit of shade at the Call of Duty series, and I gotta say that that's mighty tough words coming from a game that's got a bargain bin Captain Price. I don't think it's as bad a sequel as I've probably made it out to be though, and it does have the good sense to not drag on too long, ending just when it's starting to wear out its welcome. But it does kind of serve, I think, as a good example of how video games around 2010 started to get slightly dumbed down and simplified to appeal to a bigger audience. This period right here was like the height of gaming, back when geek culture was at an all-time high, so making something have more mass appeal and simpler to play had to be the kind of thing that made more fiscal sense to the people who choose whether or not these games get created in the first place. It's not surprising it didn't have the same effect the first game did though. I think that's like trying to wow a crowd by showing them a magic coin trick after they've just watched Houdini escape from a straitjacket. With the recent success and popularity of Modern Warfare 2, it does seem like the focus on these kind of single-player campaigns might be coming back. And while I won't say that I'd be frothing at the mouth for a Bad Company 3, I'm sure as shit wouldn't ignore it if DICE decided it was time to bring these four amigos back. It'd be sure a lot better than what we got with Battlefield 2042, I mean, that's for damn sure.
This is your stop, amigos.